that we fought a civil war in the U.S. to get rid of slavery.
But it was Christians who abolished slavery in England, though.
What was that?
It was Christians who were at the forefront of the movement to abolish slavery in England.
There were Christians on either side of everything. I mean, there's no one else to do the job.
Right, but that's the update mechanism.
Wait a second. But it was specifically Christians who were using their Christian belief as a justification for eradicating slavery.
The problem was they were actually on the losing side of a theological argument. And it would be much better, I think you would agree, if one of the 10 commandments had been, don't keep slaves. I mean, there's certainly one we could swap out for that one. And so that way, it would have been much easier for Christians to have fought against slavery. And it's much harder for Muslims, frankly, to fight against it now. The problem is that there's a point I made, I think, in my first book, is that the doors leading out of this kind of fundamentalism don't open from the inside. They get bashed open from the outside. And it's humanism and it's secularism and it's scientific rationality that has exerted such pressure, such winnowing pressure on Christianity, now for multiple centuries, that's why we're not encountering the Christians of the 14th century on a daily basis. I mean, we are essentially encountering Muslims of the 14th century, not only in the Middle East, but in our own societies, in terms of their intuitions about how we should all live, right? I mean, the fact that 0% of UK Muslims think homosexuality is acceptable, right? 0%. I mean, there's almost no question you can come up with where we could poll this society and say, do you think that the a lizard king is living in the Oval Office? You never get a 0% response to any poll question, right? But if you ask Muslims on the streets of London, is homosexuality morally acceptable? Apparently, you can find no one who says it is. That's shocking, and it's not an accident, right? And it would be much easier if the book actually said, you can love anyone you want, and it's not a problem.
It is shocking, but I think there's a reason that you keep finding yourself at Islam, which may be the slowest to update for reasons that may be ancient. But I wanted to.
Well, that is a useful.
Well, I can do it for Christianity. I want to make the point as cleanly and as undistractedly as possible. But yeah, it's true. I have the same kinds of concerns about Christianity or Mormonism or Scientology or anything else. And the point is they're all different. And there's no reason to be, because Islam, to take the case where it's fine, Islam doesn't represent any impediment to stem cell research, right? Because they just don't think that the fertilized ovum is immediately ensouled. It waits 40 days or 80 days or 120 days, depending on what hadith you believe. So it's just that never came up when we were all complaining about how religion, in this case Orthodox Judaism and Christianity in the States, was posing an impediment to embryonic stem cell research.
Okay. Hold on. I wanted to ask you a clarifying question, too.
Yeah, sure.
Same level. Would you agree that there are things written into these religious texts that are unambiguously unacceptable viewed through a modern lens, and not because the texts are so complicated that we have misunderstood something, but there are things that are just written in there that we now understand to be wrong?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that we have to be very careful about equating all the religious texts. And I do actually think that you are careful about that, but that's something we can have a discussion about a little bit later.
I agree with you there.
So because, for a lot of my life, I would say, more interested in the universal truths expressed in religious belief across different cultures. But I've become more and more aware of the important distinctions between the religious cultures, maybe in the last 10 years. So it isn't clear to me that you can just throw all religious dicta in the same bucket. And there's complex reasons for that. So, and one question, which you kind of sent at Sam already, is, do you see a hierarchy of unacceptability between different religious doctrines? I mean, and I would say yes. You acted, okay, fine. So, okay, now, but here's an interesting issue. And I think we're starting to zero in on we've covered what we agree on, a lot of it. But there's another
Would
thing.
you answer Brett's question, because I think it was a good
sorry.
one.
Sorry, I answered the first half of it, but the second part is, I think that this is where I'm going to sound like a postmodernist, which I really hate. I would say sentence by sentence, yes, you're correct. Paragraph by paragraph, perhaps. But here's the problem with complicated texts, especially ones that actually constitute narratives. So imagine this. So imagine you're at a movie, and it's a movie with a twist at the end. And so the entire movie is set up to make you think one particular way and to have one set of experiences. But when you put the twist in at the end, it changes the entire structure. And so this is one of the complex problems that actually led to the rise of postmodern interpretations of literature, which is that if you take a complex narrative, there's a very large number of ways of interpreting it, and it isn't self-evident which of those are canonically correct. And we can deal with that horrible issue later, but it's a good objection, and it's true. And what it does is it makes these sorts of things quite complicated, because in the Bible is a series of books, and they had influence on one another, and they were sequenced with a very complex editorial process, and there's actually a developmental narrative that links all the chapters together. And what that means, this is at least, I'm going to speak from the perspective, or in terms of analysis of the Christian Bible, what it means is that you have to read the beginning as if it's also influenced by the end, which is what, by the way, and in case you think that I'm weaseling around here, and I'm not, is that's exactly what you do every time you read any story, any work of fiction. You say, well, you're not claiming that the Bible is a work of fiction. It's like, that's just a cheap objection. That's not my point. My point is that it's a narrative. And everything in a narrative is conditioned by all the rest of the things in the narrative. And it's well known, like if you're a screenwriter, for example, there's an old dictum, I don't remember who generated it, was one of the great Russians, that if there's a rifle lying on a table in the first scene, that it better be used by the end of the second scene, or it shouldn't have been there at all. So there's this coherence.
I'm looking for the rifle in your answer to this question, though,
Yeah,
because I want it to be used.
My point is that it isn't reasonable to take a single sentence out of a coherent narrative and say that stands on its own, or it's rarely reasonable, because you have to interpret the word in the sentence and the sentence in the paragraph and the paragraph in the chapter and the chapter in the context of the entire book. You have to do that. Now, you could object, and reasonably so, that there are some sentences that are so blatant that you can't use context to paraphrase them, let's say. But I think you also have to give the devil its due. The Christian Bible is a developmental narrative, and the beginning has to be read in light of the end. And is it a fact?
Okay, well,
So what does that do to Moses' laws of war? This is not a narrative. This is instructions about what to do when you invade a foreign land. If you intend to take over that land, you kill everybody. Right? There are other rules in there about killing husbands and taking the wives for
the
yourself.
Old Testament's a brutal document.
Absolutely brutal. And so my point would be, I don't know that reading that portion in light of the end, even if you call the end the New Testament, I don't know that it changes Moses' laws of war and their acceptability in any modern
hypothetically, if you
context.
take the New Testament seriously, it does, because it's a document that supersedes it. And I think there's actually technical reasons
But
why
it doesn't
supersedes
supersede it on every point. I mean, this is the problem. Slavery is a very straightforward case, because clearly the Bible thumpers of the South who were defending slavery with reference to the text felt they were on firm ground. And I would invite anyone to read what the New Testament and the Old Testament say about slavery to see that they were on fairly firm ground, that the balance of the honest reading was on the side of, clearly we can keep slaves, right? Jesus never envisioned a world without slavery, and he admonished slaves to serve their masters well and to serve their Christian masters especially well.
The English Protestants wouldn't have agreed with that, because, like I said, they were at the forefront of the fight against slavery.
Okay,
so
but
I think
they
there was
were
a
clearly
range
influenced by something outside the text, and this is again, you're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why, right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that
so then you don't acknowledge that the Old Testament, so Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out. You're not going to offend me. I'm Jewish.
It's not like look, in the Old Testament itself, in the Jewish Bible, there's also the seeds of the same tension. So, for example, there's a tension, and this should be a tension that's of interest to you, because you've stated quite clearly in your book, in the Moral Landscape, that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with regards at least to religious phenomenology. You said that, for example, I still consider the world's religions to be mere intellectual ruins maintained at enormous economic and social cost, but now I understood that important psychological truths could be found in the rubble. Well, I'm trying to find the important psychological truths in the rubble. But we have to decide also if we agree about that. Like, are there important psychological truths to be found in the rubble?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
But the problem with Revelation, this notion of revelation, this notion that some books weren't written by smart people, they were written by God, confines you to taking the whole text, even though this text was cobbled together over centuries, and for whole centuries, some books were in the New Testament and then they got thrown out the centuries later, and some books weren't in and then got put in. So it's like it's an all too human process that got us these books in the first place. But once they were set, the believers imagine that you're stuck with every passage. And there are passages in the Old Testament that tell you to stone a girl or a woman who's not a virgin on her wedding night, take her to her father's doorstep and stone her to death, right? And where you find...
We can probably agree that those are wrong. So there's another point of agreement.
But you don't have to read the book to the end to know that it's wrong. I mean, you can get that from the paragraph.
Yeah, but that isn't what I said. I didn't say you had to read to the end of the book to know that it's wrong. I said that you needed to read to the end of the book to contextualize those statements within the whole. I didn't say that you needed to read.
There's no exculpatory context to those kinds of statements, and that's a problem.
Well, there is in the Old Testament. There's a real tension, and this is, I think, the tension that would be of interest to you. Is there's a tension between the dogmatic and the prophetic traditions, and I think to the degree that you're interested in religious phenomenology, you find yourself on the side of the prophetic tradition. And the prophetic tradition has implicitly in it, what would you call, an implicit damnation of those cruelly dogmatic rules. You see that emerge all the time in the prophetic tradition.
Arguably in Christianity. I think.
No, in Judaism, it's clearly there in the Old Testament with the distinction between the.
I was going once again to Islam, but every prophetic, the notion of prophecy is dangerous and worth worrying about. The idea that any ancient book contains in it a perfect description of rightly interpreted, however difficult to interpret it. If you're only smart enough, you could extract from this text a perfect window onto the future, right? And that whole generations of people have lived by the lights of this cockamamie idea. Right, that the world is going to end, and its ending is going to be glorious. Right, this is at the center of most eschatologies. It's just that when the wheels come off totally, right, that's on some levels the best thing that's ever going to happen, because it's showing you that in this case Jesus is going to come back and throw the sinners into a lake of fire. And I've read to the end of the book. It's pretty scary at the end as well. Revelation is
no kidding. Well, that's a really good objection. But, like when I did my lectures on the Bible last year, I said that they provided a psychological take on the biblical lectures, and that's what I'm going to attempt to maintain here, because I don't believe that I'm qualified to make fundamental metaphysical statements. But the scene that's delimited out at the end of Revelations, that's a very interesting book read psychologically, because it's very complicated.
This is we should talk about.
Well, let me just address that. I'll only take a minute to do it, and I'll try to be succinct. So there's an idea that's expressed in that book, is that it's something like things are always falling apart in a fundamental manner. It's built into there's an apocalyptic element to human life. We fail in small ways and we fail in catastrophic ways, and everything that we have, we lose and we die. So and societies come to an end. There's an apocalyptic element built into the structure of human reality. And part of what's revealed in that strange book at the end, which is like a hallucinogenic nightmare in some sense, is that the hero is born at the darkest point in the journey. And it's a psychological truth, and it's very, very apt, because at the darkest point, this is also why Christ is born near the darkest time of the year from a metaphysical perspective. There's an idea there that when things fall apart, that's the time for the birth of the hero. And the hero in Revelation is also the place where truthful speech most clearly manifests itself, because in the Christian tradition, Christ is identified with truthful speech. And so the notion there is that redemption under apocalyptic conditions is to be found in the revelation of truthful speech, which is something that you actually believe.
Well, I believe in truthful speech, but I also believe that you can play this kind of interpretive game with almost any text. This way of thinking.
But then you could do it with the world, Sam, and that wreaks havoc with your value from facts argument.
No, actually, I didn't hear what you just said. What was that?
Well, I said you can make exactly the same objection with the world of facts. Is there's an infinite number of facts, and there's an infinite number of potential interpretations, and so tracking the pathway from the fact to a value is actually impossible. It's the same argument with regards to biblical interpretation.
We should talk about that, but I don't think that's a good analogy. There are more and less plausible interpretations of any situation, any data, and any text, arguably. But the problem is that you can read into any story some apparently meaningful set of psychological insights, which...
But you can do that with any set of facts, too.
Well, no. I mean, there are certain things you can't over-interpret to your heart's content and come out any way you choose. My point is that first of all, this is why fundamentalism always has an edge over more sophisticated theology, because the sophisticated theology is in most cases inspired by a more and more modern recognition that, well, we can't read it literally because it either makes no sense or it makes barbaric sense, right? So we have to get away from the literal. And the more you get away from the literal, the more you are unconstrained by the text, and you can just broadcast on it anything you want to put there. And so, the literal, there's no question that most generations of Christians who read Revelation expected the world to end in some literal sense of this kind of phantasmagoria. I mean, there was going to be a beast, and it was. I mean, this. It's, undoubtedly they thought this was going to happen in their own time, under Rome. But this is if you're going to go purely literary on any of these texts, on some level, you're playing tennis without the net. You're unconstrained by the text, and you can do with it more or less anything you want.